Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this latest raw umber portrait drawing tutorial. In this hour-long drawing, I'm working with willow charcoal on white paper. And I may also end up using a bit of compressed charcoal. And you can find my favorite brand in the materials link below the video. To blend, you can use your finger or a stump or a brush or a bit of kitchen roll or tissue. And finally, to erase, I like to use a putty rubber, preferably the grey ones, as the white ones can be a bit harsh, or otherwise just a normal white rubber. So the first thing I'm going to do is cover my paper with a bit of charcoal. And for this I just use an old piece of willow charcoal. And you can see on the right, if I haven't opened up the grain, it can be a bit harsh, so make sure to use a bit of sandpaper or just work it into the paper. And I'm just covering the whole of the white sheet of paper with this, as dark as it will go. Now as you can see, this will leave a bit of texture. And so what I do to counteract this is just go over my charcoal with a bit of kitchen roll or something else. Just to blend it all together and get a nice ground for us to work on. Now the first thing I always look for in a portrait is the center line. This is the line going straight from the middle of the forehead down to the middle of the chin. Now if you make a mistake at this point or any other point in the drawing, try not to use a rubber to erase, as this would go all the way to the white of the paper. Instead, use something like a blending tool or a brush or your finger to gently blend it back into the ground that we've made at the beginning of the video. I've also placed the top and the bottom of the skull on the page, and so I now have an idea of the center line as well as the top and the bottom. And now I can start doing some measuring. So the first thing I always do is look for the midpoint in the skull. Now since she's angling downwards, we can see quite a lot of the forehead. So if I measure halfway down the page, I can see that the brows sit roughly halfway. I can also do the same thing for the quarters and see if there's anything interesting on the quarter marks. And I can see that her hairline is roughly located 1/4 down, and her nose is also roughly located 1/4 from the chin. So this way I'm just dividing the face into equal parts and seeing if I hit a really interesting mark or something I can use to measure with. Now I can also use this wave measuring not only vertically but also horizontally. So for instance, I can look at the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin and see if this fits from the cheekbone to the center line. And this way of measuring is called comparative measuring. So now we have the box of the head. Of course, that's not really a box, but we've got the sides and the top planes, and now we can start breaking these down. And when I do this, I look for big lines. For instance, we can see that the parting sort of overlaps the skull on one side. And so I'm just looking at the angle of this. And one really useful way to measure this is to imagine a clock. And we can see that compared to the vertical, the hair sits roughly at 2 o'clock. So I can now look at the rest of the hair and trying to look at all of the angles. For instance, the top of the head isn't actually flat. So what's the angle of the top of the head? I also try to judge the space between the skull and the hair, and I can see the hair is about half the size of the skull on the sides, and this gives me another useful hint together with those angles that will help me shape the shape of the skull and the hair. So you can think of this first phase of the drawing as the structured phase. I always like to use the analogy of building a house. We don't start by painting the walls, we first have to build the walls and measure where these walls are going to be. And so that's what we're doing at this first phase of the drawing. We're only measuring and finding the big structure of the face. Now, as a little side note, often we tend to think in lines, and so we tend to draw using lines, but I find that if I just slightly shade in the hair, for instance, I can see the shapes much more easily. And this way is called mass drawing. So instead of drawing with lines, we're drawing with big masses of light and shade. For instance, When I want to start looking at the box of the head, I can imagine it as a shape. And I can see that this shape gets more narrow around the nose and goes more and more narrow towards the box of the chin. And then I can take that shape and just start narrowing it down by joining the corners of that to the hair. So I'm adjusting the shape not by drawing a line, but by adding more of a darker shade. So that's a really useful way to start thinking and seeing, because ultimately everything we see are just shapes. So let's have a look at the features. Now the first thing I'm going to do is simplify them. So for instance, for the brow and the eye socket, I'm going to look at the base of the brow, and I'm going to start looking at a triangle that sits underneath the eye, and then back up to the other side of the corner of the eye and the brow. And I like to imagine that I'm just basically drawing some sunglasses. And this is a very useful shape because this is the structure of the bones of the cheekbone, and later we will add smaller light shapes to create the eyes. Keep an eye out for the little shape in between the brows that connects the brows to the start of the bridge of the nose. So I'm just going to go down the face looking for the main dark shapes of each feature. The next thing I look for is the bottom of the nose. And even though there's a lot of detail there, ultimately the bottom of the nose is darker than the top and the sides of the nose. And so I'm going to start blocking in a rough shadow shape there. Dropping down 2 lines from each side of the eye socket, making sure that the nose is more or less symmetrical. And when I measure, the width of the nose should be about half of the eye socket. Another useful shape to look out for is the Rembrandt triangle. And this is the little light shape that sits in between the cheekbone and the bridge of the nose. And it's called the Rembrandt triangle because Rembrandt used this all the time in his paintings. And it's a really useful shape to look for when you have a portrait that's lit up from the side or from the top. Now, as you can see, I'm still using tones to draw these shapes and not lines, but if you have a dark tone next to a dark tone, feel free to use a line in between in order to clarify that bit. And let's finally have a look at the lips. Now with a top-down light situation, the bottom lip will always be a light shape. And the top lip will always be a shadow shape. This is because the top lip turns downwards and the bottom lip turns upwards. So I'm just using a placeholder shape for the mouth here, paying attention to how wide it is compared to the other features. And then I can start refining it using the shapes that I see on the model. Now I've ignored the hand for now, because I was focusing on the structure of the face and the symmetry of the face. But if you're up for it, use the same method of looking for dark and light shapes to find the main blocks of the hand and the fingers. Now as you can see, slowly a face is starting to emerge from the page. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes just adjusting some of my shapes, adding some extra shapes where I see them, before moving on to the next phase of the drawing. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Alright, so at the next part of the drawing, I want to continue working with shapes, but instead of using only dark shapes, I'm going to go in with my rubber and cut out the light shapes. For this, I really like to use a putty rubber because it's really nice and precise. But if you don't have a putty rubber, you can also cut a piece of your white rubber to make it a bit more of a precise shape. And the first thing I'm going to look for is the shape surrounding the eye. Now again, I'm trying to keep this fairly simple. So I'm only looking for the shape of the corner of the eye, the shape of the lower lid, and the shape that sits on top of the eye in between the brow and the eyelid. Now for the purpose of this exercise, I've made these shapes really harsh. This makes them easier to see, but of course the skin is really rather soft. So feel free to blend these shapes in a little bit to make it all seem a bit more natural. Now the other eye is a bit more tricky because it's actually in shadow. This means that even the white of the eye will be much darker than we think. So I'm not going to add anything with the rubber there for now, and instead I'm going to work my way down, looking for the light shapes in the light. For instance, we can look at the bridge of the nose, which is fairly bright and has a nice clean highlight there. And I'm also looking for the tip of the nose and the shape of the tip of that nose. And once I have this shape, I can then use my blending tool or my finger or whatever you have available to gently blend this in to the rest of the tones of the drawing. Now this may seem a bit uncomfortable at first, to be really precise with your drawing shapes and to then blend them all together, but as you can see, I can easily add and subtract multiple times, making my shapes more precise as I go. So it's a really useful way to draw without having to commit from the start. So for instance, now I'm looking at the V shape of the philtrum connecting with the top lip. Again, using my rubber to cut out the shapes as precise as I can, and then using my blending tools to gently blend this in. Same thing for the shape of the lower lip. And something that I find really useful when looking for shapes is squinting at the picture, or even taking a picture and putting it in black and white. Because especially with something like the lips, the reddish color can really throw us off and we stop seeing the light versus the dark shapes. So squinting is really useful. Next, I want to talk about something called simultaneous contrast. And what this means is that if we have two dark things next to each other, for instance the shadow of the cheek versus the darker tones of the hair, it makes the shadow of the cheek look really light. And so the natural inclination would be to start lightening this with the rubber. But this is actually, even though it's counterintuitive, not the right thing to do. Because what you would do then is make the shadows as light as the lights. And if we compare that light on the cheekbone versus the highlight on the nose, they're really nowhere near as bright. So instead, what I like to do is darken areas in the shadows, and that will make that cheekbone pop out. So a good rule of thumb to use is everything in the lights can only go lighter, everything in the dark, so the shadows, can only go darker. So for instance with the hands, we've got some pretty clear light shapes, and so I'm going to cut these out using the rubber to indicate the fingers, in the same way as I did on the features. And again, blending these in if they're a little bit too harsh. Same thing for the shadows. I'm not making these lighter, instead I'm looking for the darker shapes, trying to become more precise as I go. And then again blending these in once I'm happier with the shapes. Now for those of you who've got a subscription, we've got a really exciting hands video coming up with Charlie. And of course we have some hand-only studies in the archives as well, so have a look at that if you'd like to have a bit more focus on how to draw the hand. Next I'm going to start drawing the hair, and with the hair you can have a bit more fun because it doesn't all have to be that precise. But I'm still using the same techniques of darkening my darks and lightening my lights using the rubber. For instance, for the tips of the hair that are a bit lighter, I'm just drawing some fairly loose strokes with the rubber, starting the stroke where it's lightest and then letting it fade out and merge as the hair gets a little bit darker. And these strokes can be really loose because of course hair is not perfectly soft, it's quite rough, it's quite random, and so our strokes can be the same. The same thing for the highlight, and what I find really useful here is to make the highlight as connected as possible. I try not to draw individual hairs, instead I try to look for the light impression. So again, feel free to squint quite a lot, so you can see the band of light going from the brow area up towards the top left. And once again, I'm blending this in and then adding my darker shapes as well. Now once I've got this general light impression in, I can then add some hair accents to create some texture, for instance at the top of the hairline. When working with texture, I tend to either put the texture in the highlights or in the darkest accents and leave the midtones sort of quite vague. So when I'm now going to start adding these accents, I'm going to focus most on the highlight on the left and the roots of her hair, near the top of her head. Alright, so at this point we've got our values and tones in, and there should be an impression of a face. And even if you get this far during this drawing, that's already a really good exercise. Now next, what I'm going to do is start working into these shapes. And for this I like to use a slightly sharper pencil, so a compressed charcoal pencil in this case, and I'm just going to start darkening and drawing out some shapes. For instance, I can draw out the shape of the iris, connecting this up with the shape of the top lid. And just like I did for the other tones, once I'm happy with the shape, I'm then blending this together. And note that I have joined both my darks up into one shape, and I'm going to do the same thing with the lights. So the white of the eye will join up with the light shape of the lower lid. And even though this may feel counterintuitive, losing shapes, it actually feels very natural and makes the drawing look more realistic. This is because in real life we don't always have a nice clean outline around each shape. Sometimes things are a bit more obscured, and so we can use this in drawing to make things more realistic. Even if it's not quite as obscured in the photograph, we can make it even more lost in the drawing. So for instance, looking at the side of the eye, I'm going to lose this into the shadow of the cheekbone. And this is called a lost edge. You're basically losing one shape into another. And even though this seems counterintuitive, it actually strengthens the drawing. So I'm just adding another lost edge, the forehead here. And I'm losing some of that outline into the hair. And again, it may feel like it's wrong to do, but it actually strengthens the drawing because it allows the focus to be on the eye rather than on the outlines of the face. So before, I was saying that I didn't want to add any light shapes to the eye that's in shadow. But at this stage we can start adding darker shapes in order to draw the eye. And so I'm going to do the same thing as I did in the first eye. And that's drawing the shape of the top lid as well as the iris. And as you can see, just by adding this dark shape in these shadows, the shadows suddenly seem a lot lighter by comparison. And this is called that simultaneous contrast that I spoke about before. So again, always darken the darks and lighten the lights, and try not to use the rubber into the darks at all. Now again, I want to add a lost edge here to make it feel a little bit more realistic, and so I'm letting the eye disappear into the shadow that's cast by the hair onto the forehead. So let's move on to the other features. Again, working our way down. And the first thing I'm going to look at is the darker shapes of the nose. Again, only adding darker shapes to the shadows and lighter shapes to the lights. I find that when working in the shadows, it's useful to just outline some of the shadow that needs to be a bit more clear, and also some of the structural planes, for instance the nostrils, maybe even the inside of the nostrils, that darker accent. But because the nose is not a part that I want to focus on, I'm gonna blend it in even more than I did with the eyes, creating even more of a lost edge. Now the more I can lose the tip of the nose into the light, the more it will feel like the nose slowly turns under. So I may do this a few times, adding some darker tones, blending them in, and then re-adding. And then once again, because that blending has slightly darkened the lights, I can just add a few highlights using my rubber. And then coming back to the darks of the nose again. So we can do this as many times as we like. We're building up the tones slowly by adding them in and erasing and blending again. And the darker I can make the edge of the shadow, the more it feels like the nose is sticking out. And then of course, adding in a lost edge near the bottom of the shadow into the lip. So I'll just spend a few moments here, pushing my shapes around, adjusting them as I see. If you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Alright, so for the mouth, I can again outline my shapes using my compressed charcoal, figuring out the top of the lip as well as the dividing line between the lips. And again remembering to only add darks in the top lip, which is a dark shape or a shadow shape, and staying away from the lower lip, which is in the lights. And then, just like I did in the other features, looking for a few lost edges in the darks, connecting the darks up together. And one of the reasons why these lost edges in the shadows can be really powerful for a drawing is that our eye can only focus on either light or dark at the same time. So imagine you're coming out of a dark room into the bright sunny day. You can imagine that your eyes will be blinded for a moment and need some time to adjust. The same thing if you then go back into a dark room. At the start you can't really see anything. This is because our eyes have adjusted to the light or the dark. And so in drawing, most of the time you want to focus either to be on the lights or on the darks. Now with a portrait, most of the time that will be in the lights. And so the more we compress and join our darks together, the more we have that illusion of the focus on the light and the dark sort of fading out of the picture, similar to how our eyes work naturally. Now, in order to join the features up with the rest of the face, I may spend a little bit of time on the cheekbones here, just losing some of that darker shadow into the features. Again, if you want to emphasize the line between the neck or the hair and the skull, try darkening around the skull rather than lightening some of these darker planes. And sometimes it can also look good to add a core shadow, which is a dark line or plane or gradation near the light. And this helps make the shadow feel like it's turning. Again, try not to lighten that shadow on the jaw too much, because as you can see when I lighten it, that really flattens the drawing. Instead, try to keep it nice and dark and try to lose it in as many places as you can see. Of course, we may have to find it in some places, but really try to see how much you can get away with losing in the darks. Now, a lot of the work we've been doing with losing edges in the shadows means that we can add more focus in the lights. And so in order to do this, I'm going to add some more precise, sharp shapes around the eyes in the lights to give them a bit more focus, to counteract the softness we have in the shadows. And while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Otherwise, I will speak to you at the end of the pose. Alright, so that's the end of the pose for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed learning about playing with tones. If you'd like to show us your work, feel free to use the photograph button right here in the chat. Or if you'd like to, use the hashtag #RawUmberLive if you use Instagram. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. We do 2 videos a week, Wednesday on a figure drawing and Sunday one of these portrait drawings, as well as lots of extra bonus videos for our gold subscribers. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.